In today's Roleplay Geeks matchup, it's Roll20 versus Fantasy Grounds, Bagpipes versus one-string flutes, Elvis versus the Police, and Pintos versus Mavericks. No punches are pulled, no quarter is given. What started out as a review of Fantasy Grounds, the virtual tabletop application, quickly turned into a series of throwdowns in this week's Roleplay Geeks. Stick around to learn about exploding cars, Elvis sightings, the ins and outs of Fantasy Grounds, and the first ever Roleplay Geeks 12 questions, where we actually only asked 5 of the 12. Welcome to Roleplay Geeks. This is Frank.
This is your token hippie, John.
This is Jim.
This is Steve.
And this is Steve-O, a.k.a. the other Steve.
Today, we're going to be joined by our friend Andrew. Welcome, Andrew.
Glad to be here.
And we're going to talk a little bit on our continuing series on sort of how to do role-playing in a pandemic where you're all sort of quarantined from each other. And this is something that isn't necessarily indicative of just a pandemic, obviously, because of times and schedules and spatial distances. For example, the other Steve is quite a bit distant from us. Doing this sort of thing is something that can go beyond an emergency situation. Now, we already did an episode on Roll20, and now we're turning to Fantasy Grounds. Now, Fantasy Grounds, I think, I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure it is kind of the original all-in-one solution, computer-based. It's out there, because it's been around for a really long time, something like 12 years, 13 years, something like that. It's been in existence in some form or fashion. Andrew has been kind enough, because he has invested a lot of time and energy into Fantasy Grounds. He's been kind enough to run the rest of the Roleplay Geeks through a campaign for the last 2 weeks so that we can experience it. And so today's episode, we're just going to spend some time talking a little bit about our experience with Fantasy Ground, what we liked, what we didn't like, what we'd like to see. So let's get started. Overall, let's go with overall opinions of what do we think of the experience thus far. I'm going to just go through the list. I'll start. I have real issues with Fantasy Grounds, but overall, I think it's been a very good experience if you augment it with other technology. Jim, what do you think?
Yep, pretty good. I like it. I haven't used some of the features, so I'm anxious to dive into some of the things we haven't used, like the whiteboard, because I like my whiteboard.
Steven, what do you think?
It has turned out far better than I expected when I first looked at the demo by myself ages ago. And for anything that requires calculation, it is a godsend. And I really do not relish the thought of going back to pen and paper for something like, my God, Pathfinder. If I could do Pathfinder using Fantasy Grounds from now on, I'd enjoy going back to play Pathfinder.
The other Steve, your thoughts?
I was very impressed. I will say up front that I found the learning curve a little steep, but it's because there is so many features and so many controls. It does not include any kind of communication, such as some of the others. But once we got into it, if we hadn't had Andrew, for instance, to really talk us through it and teach us how to use it, it would have took much, much longer to use and to get proficient with it. But other than that, I'm super impressed with the way it is. As Stephen was saying, calculate your dice rolls, all your modifiers, all that stuff's all calculated in there. It's great. I've had a great time playing it for sure, especially for Dungeons and Dragons, which tends to be a little combat heavy.
John, what are your thoughts broadly?
I was not expecting much when we first started out. I was not really thrilled with it. I thought getting into it, the learning curve was kind of nuts. I mean, as I said, again, it's a part of it. I think is just an issue with the interface. It's kind of an awkward interface. It's an older style interface, but I have been very impressed overall. It has worked exceptionally well. I'd say a lot of that's just because of Andrew, just because he knows it very well and has been like, oh, let me tell you that for the 18th time. Yes. You click on that.
Hey, don't bring me into this.
It's everyone has done it.
I say it's not.
Everyone's like, well, I can't see the map. Oh my God! Click on your icon and your thing. He's told us this 3 times yesterday, 17 times the day before when we played.
Again, that's because the controls are not that intuitive.
Exactly.
Well, okay, let's not get too far into the weeds there yet. We'll get there.
But I think it is actually quite robust. especially like some of the stuff where he's got some things calculated already, where you can just fly through battles. And I agree with both Steves on this. I mean, I was impressed with what it did, and then especially for something like where you get a little bit more constant combat and stuff, it works really well. So you're not constantly keeping track of, that's right, that guy attacked you, but he was already dead. Some of those things you can kind of take care of and weed them out and keeping track of it as a GM. It really helps. It seems to be very well done.
So the more interesting person to ask here, I think, is Andrew. So Andrew, from your perspective, how has it gone as somebody who obviously, as we've all noted, have a lot of experience and expertise with it, dealing with an entire party of people who have no idea what the hell they're doing with this technology?
And you also have that kind of enfeebled old minds that barely work.
Hey!
Yeah.
I think it's gone very well. I think knowing people that already know how to role play and have a general idea, it makes it easier to guide you through it. Again, it's just really overcoming the interface, and you're right, it does have a steep learning curve. You got to be kind of patient with people to kind of get the rhythm. But I think by the second session, you guys were rolling right along, kind of had a rhythm, knew what you needed to do next, knew what to click next, and it was moving much smoother.
Well, especially after, the first round, last time we played, I was like at 0 hit points, so pretty easy for me. All I had to do was lay on the ground.
That was by design.
So let's talk a little bit about the positives. So we've already delved a little bit into the negatives, but overall, I think one positive we identified is the complexity of things like combat. D&D, going back to the first edition, has always had a lot of general philosophy as we should have a rule that covers every scenario, and keeping track of all those rules is kind of challenging even for the most adept dungeon master. And I think Andrew would agree that the fact that the software just does most of that makes it so much easier to do the part of dungeon mastering that most people want, which is run a game and have fun.
Yeah, that's definitely true. The combat encounters are also a little more balanced because of that. The rules are built around sort of the assumption that both players and monsters in an encounter are going to be using their abilities, and it's going to be optimized. And if you forget that a particular immunity exists or a particular vulnerability exists, then that can really throw the encounter way off. And having the software sort of double check all of those variables is an advantage. And
I would like to add, if you were just looking at, for listeners that's never seen what Fantasy Grounds looks like, imagine a map, a typical dungeon module map, and all the map pieces, the tokens, that represent players and monsters are out there. And one feature I loved was you can take, when it's your dice roll, you can target and pick one of the monsters that you want to attack and just pull the 20-sided die right over top of it and then drop it on the map for your roll to pick that one. Or you can do it in another screen called the combat screen or something. What's that one called? The
combat tracker.
Yeah, the combat tracker. It keeps track of turns, all that stuff. It's great. And then if Andrew has to intervene, which he has a couple of times, he can, of course, modify or change any of the results. For the most part, man, combat just smoothly sails through there. You cast a spell. It's an area effect spell. For instance, Frank's playing a bard, and he was able to do some inspiring spells and things like that, and automatically put it on all of the players. So we're not even having to think about it. Those modifiers are just all there. It's great. It's awesome. Easy.
Inspiring despite the fact he's out of tune half the time.
Well, he's still learning.
He's still learning. His flute only has one string.
He plays the hell out of it, though.
Did you say lute or flute?
Sure.
His flute only has one string. That's the reason he's such a bad bard.
I actually do. My character actually does have a lute and basically a recorder. So.
Oh, there you go. Hey, man, I know one thing. Next time I play a bard, it's bagpipes. Oh, yeah.
The problem is that's a two-handed weapon.
Yeah, that would be awkward.
What are you talking about, man? A lute's a two-handed one.
Not the way I play, baby. Anyway, we're going off on a tangent.
Sorry.
I mean, one string only needs one hand, right? So that's the good stuff. And there's some other good stuff in there. For example, from a ease of use point of view, or I should say expense point of view, really you only need one person to buy into the software. And once they do that, if you get to the highest level, then everybody else gets to play essentially for free. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Andrew, is if that person buys the supplemental information, that gets pushed out for free to all your users, right?
Yeah, it gets pushed out while they're connected to the server. It's not going to be on your machine after the game if you logged out. But the way Fantasy Grounds is set up is that there is a server on the DM's machine, and all of the content that the DM has purchased is pushed out based on the rules that the DM has set to the players. And in fact, this is one of the differences between it and Roll20 is that because the content is on your machine, you don't need to be connected to an external network. You could play at home on a local network if you wanted. And so then the players connect to the DM server, and any of the content that the DM has purchased gets downloaded, pushed to the player's screen. So they don't have to have the player's handbook and the monster manual and the DMG, and they don't have to have a copy of the module. They get that information while they're connected to the server. You don't have access to it when you've logged out of the game, but as long as you're connected to the DM's machine, you've got access.
Yeah, so that can be advantageous if you've got limited funds or players with limited funds, obviously. And the nice thing is everyone gets kind of a copy. So there's no more of this trading around Bob's player's handbook and Sally's DM guide to find the random table you need for the one thing you need, which I think is a big benefit. And so the downside, of course, is that financially the burden does tend to go on one person to, that's not radically different than a lot of role playing, though. Oftentimes one person will buy the source materials, so it's not out there, but that is something to be aware of. Now we've talked a little bit about the good. Let's talk a little bit about the bad and the stuff that isn't so good or could be better. And I'm going to go ahead and start because I have a very strong opinion about this. It is without a doubt the single worst interface I've ever had the displeasure of using in all my years of computing. And that's saying a lot because I've used Esri's software. So it's just, I'm not even sure that it's fair to say it's counterintuitive because that's giving it too much credit. And the thing is that part of it is because what the developers have clearly spent their time on and probably should have spent their time on is the algorithms that drive everything in the background, because that's the important bit. The part that we think is amazing is the part that just, I'll do the math. Don't worry about the other stuff. And they haven't gotten on board anybody that knows, I don't know, the very most basic of basic things about interface design. And it drives me crazy. But once you get through it and figure out what its weird idiosyncrasies are, it's very cool. But getting to that point was so painful, if I'm being there.
I'd rather use it than iTunes any day of the week.
iTunes is the worst piece of software I've ever used, but this is the worst interface I've ever used.
Yeah, this does remind me a lot of Arc Desktop. It's just horrible in how things are laid out. How you're just expected to come up with the idea that, you drag things into other panels. I've seen a couple other pieces of software that do something similar, and it's always horrible. I think some of the developers think that, this is a really cool idea. Or it's someone that was, they were being told to do, I got this really cool idea for a piece of software. Can you code this? Sure. And that's the way it kind of feels. It was just like somebody had an idea and thought it would be super neat and unique way to do things, and there's a reason why it's not done that way across the industry. Interface design is one of those things that being different and unique is not really a benefit. And that's one of the things I think that Fantasy Grounds is plagued with. But, the computational ability where it kind of handles a lot of things for you, that is fantastic. But, wow, the interface is just horrible.
What say you, Maura?
So the interface isn't bad. It's not nearly as bad as anyone's saying it is. If you look at it from when it came from,
awful.
It's not as bad as I said.
That's like saying that a wife beater isn't as bad if you consider their upbringing. It's still bad. You can understand why it's bad, but it's so bad.
Frank feels strongly about this one.
Yeah. No. So if you look at when it came out and what it was trying to replicate, it fits in with other applications and games from the same period. You're talking about somebody who obviously wasn't a user interface designer. And I said before that I thought it reminded me of the Baldur's Gate, the original version, its interface. the look and feel of it, the iconography. What it suffers from most is the fact that this was designed, 20 years ago, and the design was kept. So they kept adding on features and features and features, but the way that you click on some things, the way that you move other things, those kinds of bits of the interface seem to have stayed the same. Things have a definitive place within the interface, which allows you some consistency when you're learning it. If it wasn't for the consistency of windows, of static things on the left of the page, the right of the page, where the dice are, things like that, it would be just an untenable interface. But as it is, it's an archaic interface. So with time, you do learn it because you can. Now
I have to disagree with you. It is not consistent.
No, it isn't consistent.
It is not consistent.
It isn't consistent.
No. I'm not saying about how things move. What I was saying, and I said this, I said you click, the way you interact with things is different. So you can click on some things, you can pull on some things, you double click on other things. So those parts of the interaction are inconsistent. But the way that things are, you have your dock on the right, you have your chat on the left, you have your dice at the bottom. You click on this, a window is going to follow almost the same format as another, but it's those interface interactions that have stayed the same and haven't changed and haven't become consistent that for me are the biggest barrier to using the application.
It's the map. The map window behaves differently than the other windows. The other windows have a scroll bar along the side, and when you run the mouse wheel, you slide up and down, and in the map, it zooms by default. If you try to drag in the map instead of the map moving, where you're dragging like it would be if you were using the hand tool in an image application, the window moves, not the map. There are modifier keys that you hold down to resize the window. You hold down the control button while you're dragging the window to resize it. You wouldn't know that unless you read it. It's not very obvious that you would do that. And you can't resize the windows from more than the lower right corner of the window. If you try to resize it from another corner, it won't work. Those little things. So I think probably 50 to 60% of the issue is trying to navigate within the map window that is so frustrating. And those are the easy fixes, I would.
Yeah, see, the thing that's kind of interesting here is that the map is the one thing that I will give it, a pass on, to be honest with you, because of some of what Steve said, which was when this was created, the way we interact with maps wasn't really set down. So it predates Google Maps, basically. So, and Google Maps more or less invented the conventions that we've all agreed upon as this is how you navigate a digital map, for good or bad. And it predates that, so it was trying to do its own thing. Now, what it did is weird and kind of asinine, but I understand why it said, well, I have to come up with something. I don't agree with Steve that I think this was a bad interface for its time as a person who played a lot of games during the time this was constructed, and I think that it's a poor implementation of Baldur's Gate. I get that it was trying to emulate it, but it's a little bit like, again, I have to go with an analogy of some sort. It's like the Chinese car manufacturers trying to emulate a Cadillac. It just does it poorly.
I never said it was a good interface. I said it was representative of the time, and it's not the worst.
I don't think it is representative of the time. I think it's emulating one piece of software at the time, and it's doing it badly. There's a lot of better interfaces that were done at the time that could have emulated and done.
You're right. It does sort of remind me of like those early video games like Baldur's Gate. I guess there's two ways to look at it. When I'm messing around with it, it feels like I'm getting into a video game for the first time, and you have to figure out all the controls, because a lot of video games, particularly in those early years, they each had their own idiosyncrasies, and you sort of had to get in there and figure it out. But once you did, you were good to go, and it felt that way to me when I was playing around with it. And I agree absolutely with Andrew. Probably the two things that frustrate me the most is both on the map screen. The number one thing is the scrolling. I like when you're moving around the map. I just don't like that, and I agree. I think that should be something easy to fix. But being a software engineer, sometimes it seems like it would be easy, but you just don't know what's under the hood that would, that you got to go through in order to get things to work. And then the resizing. That's another thing. So like with Roll20, if I want to, I can do pop-out windows for the character sheets and put them on a separate monitor. With Fantasy Grounds, I've sort of got to stretch the entire screen across both monitors, and then I can do that. I can sort of get there, but it's a little clunky, but you can get there.
Yeah, I find the volume of windows I end up opening to keep track of things gets in my way. Because it's like, okay, especially with the bard. So part of this is I'm playing a character that I've never really played before. So some of it is I just don't understand what they can do. So I have to open up a lot of those. This is what your ability is, description. So I can read it and say, okay, this is what I can do. So I have like 3 or 4 of those open. And that's part of the problem. But
I will have to say, Frank, I think you're playing it wrong. Because from everything that I've been reading on the web, what you're supposed to be doing is seducing and having sex with everything.
well,
I mean, that's what I've been reading on like Reddit and stuff like that. The bard is just supposed to seduce every single thing they come across, and that's how they defeat it.
sadly, I picked College of Lore. So,
yeah, you're useless then.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that Frank's bard is actually a
Yeah.
Very well put. Or worse, a bass player.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's not get ridiculous.
At least he's not the keyboard player.
There you go.
If you've ever played in bands,
Might as well play tambourine.
if you've ever played in bands, the dumbest person in a band is always the drummer. Sorry, Dave.
Yeah. Dave, we hope you're not
Chase,
listening.
don't hurt me, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, the number of windows is a problem for me, but I mean, that's part of what I'm doing. And I keep doing Alt-Tab because I'm used to it has like a windowed interface, which makes sense, but you do Alt-Tab, it completely jumps you to, Chrome or whatever other application you have, and you go, oh yeah, that's annoying. So
I know for me, I mean, I think, for instance, I think I was the first one to get on and try and roll up a character. It's just so many little tiny things that if you don't know how to do it, it would be pretty daunting, I think, for someone who's never used this software. We have Andrew, he explains everything to us as we go along, but I got on by myself
4 times.
Exactly. And when I got on to try and create my character, it's so weird. Like Andrew told us, start with 5th level characters. I pull my sheet up, do all that, and I'm reading the instructions. But it's not clear that you take your character class and pull it over 5 times to make it a 5th level character instead of just typing 5. I'm level 5. I have to pull my character class over 5 times. And I never did successfully do that until the night we played. I had to go back and fix that because Andrew explained it. There's just so many complex little things that I've thought about going ahead and spending the $150, or actually I'm going to wait till it goes on Steam, sale for Steam. Back in March, they had it at half price, about $75. And, because I want to try Traveler and I want to try maybe Call of Cthulhu just to see what those are like. But I swear it's so complex. I'm pretty gun shy of trying that. And opposed to the fact that Roll20 is totally free. So unless you buy the premium, but all you really get's lighting or
Dynamic lighting.
They have a $10 a month subscription fee for the Ultimate. You may want to do that for a few months to get your.
Yeah, I may try that. But again, I'm just so gun shy of trying to run a game using it just because of the complexities we've talked about and the wonkiness of the interface. It's just not intuitive to me at all.
What's really weird about that level thing is this is an example where the interface is inconsistent because you can type a number in there. It just doesn't seem to do anything. Like when you're setting your levels, and it was like, well, why didn't it take it would have been better if it just didn't allow you to type in something. Then be like, oh, okay, I have to figure out a different way.
You're exactly right. You can type 5, and then I'm thinking, okay, I've got my 5th level character. You can type it in there, but you don't get all the bonuses. You don't get the extra stuff you get with the actual levels. So weird.
We have been using that for a little while. We used Fight Club on the iPhone. And it has, character creation and level advancement and everything else. And of course, it's a touch interface and everything, but it is actually very clean and neat for doing exactly that. it was pretty, because I think we did something similar. Like I think we did like third level or something, and it was very easy just to go ahead and do it. And then it walks you through doing it. Oh, okay, we'll go ahead and level you up and go through all the stuff of each level. So you've leveled up, to the level 3, so we need to do that twice to get you the third level. And it walks you through it very straightforward. And it does it like each level at a time. And it's like, that's just an app on a phone. And that's one of those things that's kind of, I find kind of amazing that we can get, that level of sophistication from something as simple as that. And this product that's been out a while, I mean, I hate to kind of keep harping on it, but half of us are programmers, and so that's where we come from. It's like when we see like what we consider bad coding or bad interface, it comes across. So
I think you should forgive a lot of it just because that's what I do for a living, and having written many bad interfaces on a regular basis, I guess I'm a little sympathetic to the plight of the programmer.
I would think it would be more forgivable if it wasn't so expensive. If it was a free product, then I would say, man, this thing is unbelievable for free. But I mean, in order to get the ultimate, you got to pay $150 or subscribe for $10 a month, or everyone in your group has to buy the $40 version. And then you don't get all the bells and whistles.
Red America, you want everything free.
Well, again, going back to Mara's earlier point of when this was developed, it was an economic landscape where for $40-$50 you got a better interface in a video game, and it hasn't updated since then. And so I think that the other Steve's point is well taken in that Roll20, we almost all agree, has a crappy interface, but it's also free, right? So at one level you go, well, I'm not paying for it, so who am I to complain too terribly much? Which is, I think, why I'm a little more critical of the interface. Let's move on to a couple other important points that people should consider. Steve-O mentioned this earlier on, but it does not have any built-in communication. So if you want to have audio-video chat, the way you have to do that is turn to another outside piece of software, which I personally don't think is much of an issue. I don't actually want to give it any knocks for that personally, because I think the tool, in some ways, I like tools that do what they do well and use other tools to do what they do well.
Well, and it does have a chat interface. And if you played any old MMOs or IRC gaming, then the chat interface was sort of the standard. And I think that the video part, is a bonus. A lot of MMOs still don't come with a video feature.
Yeah, you look at Roll20. I mean, they have video and chat integrated. We don't use it.
Yeah, because it's not very good.
So, I mean, it's not a big deal. Not from where I'm sitting.
Yeah, definitely not a deal breaker. You can use Discord, Skype, etc. Just run it in a separate window. That's what I've been doing when we do Roll20 and also Fantasy Ground. So, yeah, not an issue, really.
And also, I think people should be aware that Andrew mentioned this, is that when you are the person who has a supplement, you act as a server. So that's going to push a lot of data. So the first night we played, we had issues with video using Discord and pushing all that data because there was a saturation of the bandwidth available. And that was, go ahead.
That was actually my error on my end. I had shared the entire module instead of just pushing out bits. So you were getting all of you were getting a huge file that you didn't really need. So that was part of our issue.
Yeah, and Steve Hill was using a dial-up modem. He since is upgraded.
56K, man. I was going to say, I would be interested to hear more from Andrew of his experience of using it, learning it, opinion of the software. He obviously likes it, used it quite a long time. So
I think I wanted to touch on the economic issues that you were discussing, and I was thinking that the time saving for the DM is huge. It can't be underestimated. Will you save the 10 hours at $10 to $15 an hour in the first time you set up a game? Yes, you will. If you take that extra time and go mow lawns or something, and you'd be better off because you can take that money and buy the game and zip through prep. The drag and drop. You guys don't see this, but if you were to create an encounter from scratch, it's just very simple. You import a graphic download a map off of Google or whatever, import that graphic, create a text for the room. You can copy and paste it out of a PDF that you've got. You drop a pin from that text entry onto the map, and now you've hyperlinked that. So when you're showing the map to the players and you click on the pin, the text you just created pops up and describes the room to you. So you don't have to shuffle through books or shuffle through notebooks trying to find that particular entry. If I want to create an encounter, I open up an encounter entry, I drop the NPCs onto that encounter, and then I attach that to the story entry that I had. Now, when I click on the pin on the map, it pulls up a description of the room, and there's another little link there for the encounter. I can click on that link for the encounter, and I can have the location of the creatures preset on the map. I hit one button, it loads all of the creatures onto the map and loads them onto the combat tracker. So as far as prep work, being able to create an adventure from scratch, the time saving is just huge. And even if you don't have the DMG or the player's handbook, the SRD is included with the ultimate package. So all of the stats, all the stat blocks for every creature are already entered. You don't have to manually put those in. You've got those. And if you did purchase the player's handbook and the DMG, then all the stats for every magic item, every monster, every NPC, they're already coded for you. So you just drag them over from the NPC list into your encounter and it's done. You don't have to create a separate notepad or a sheet. And if you're doing it from, pen and paper, that's incredibly time consuming to put together an adventure. Before I started using Fantasy Grounds, because I use Fantasy Grounds in a face-to-face game that I play. And everybody brings their laptop and we sit around the table and I push the map and we discuss, we don't need to use the Discord or for communications. And we have the game's slower because we have a lot of, the same stuff, the goofing off and stuff that you do at the table is present. But before we were using Fantasy Grounds, I was setting up the miniatures and printing out the maps and the hours I was taking to stitch maps together and create a board and put my miniatures together to be able to load up for an encounter I was expecting them to have. And then they may bypass that encounter and I was having to scramble with additional stuff to put together on the table. And with Fantasy Grounds, all of that's just already pre-done.
Yeah, so I think, and this is an important point of view because the rest of us have not had the opportunity to do this as a DM. So, Andrew, how long do you think it took you to get, I don't want to use the word proficient, but what's the word I'm looking for here? Maybe
not
capable.
An idiot?
Well, yeah, that would be using the interface to do those things that you're talking about. And, how much work did it take to get you to that point?
I think it was an evolution, sort of an expansion of skills over time. You learn the core skills that you have, and then you don't realize that it does something, and then the next week you get something else that you sort of incorporate into it. Much like you would if you were using a high-end graphics program like Photoshop. You don't know what all the features do, and what you use the tools that you do understand, and you ignore the tools that you don't, and then you say, I wish it could do this, and then you Google that, and oh, yeah, it does do that. You just need to do this particular thing, and then you've added something more to your tool set. I think probably within a month, maybe 4 games or so, I was, as a player, not tripping over myself. I have a little bit of, coding experience, that sort of thing, a lot of design experience. So I think that maybe my learning curve was a little more shallow than it might be for others. But probably within a couple months, I was ready to DM. I would recommend definitely before you try to DM a game with it, that you play a game. The forums on Fantasy Ground have a look. There's a looking for group forum, and usually you can find a game within a week to join up and just watch another DM and try several DMs because you learn. I learn my, the little tricks every week. I learn something new from another player.
One thing that's kind of cool about this is it seems to have a degree of expandability that you don't get with a lot of other things. So I was going to make a joke up until Wednesday about it's got more brown than the average middle manager parking lot in the 70s looking at their cars interiors. I mean, it's just as brown can brown. But Andrew pushed out a whole new skin that was a gray interface. And the brown, somewhat thematically makes sense because it's kind of a woodish color for D&D. But if you were going to do something like Traveler, which Steve-O mentioned, you would want something a little more sci-fi looking, and the gray works out for that. So there's some degree to change it, I think, if I can understand that correctly. And then you mentioned something about people have programmed effects or macros for things. Could you talk a little bit more about that? For like, you're pushing out, I know in some of my spells, I'll have a spell and you'll push out a thing. I don't really know what it is that allows me to push buttons that make things happen.
Yeah, there's an active community of users that are creating extensions and modules for the game that expand its usefulness. So to help automate some of the effects, many of those have to be manually encoded. And this guy named Rob Toohey has some products that he sells on DM Guild, and he has coded pretty much every effect, every spell, every magic item. And they're not expensive. You can download those, add them to your game. Most of those effects, once you've seen them in another game, you can sort of figure it out. There's a webpage on how you can code them yourself. But for $4, it'll save you the hours of typing to need to load those in. And it's definitely worth, adding to your package to do, because it does streamline the game. Extensions can change the interface look a little. There's some limits. They all seem to have the same usability issues we already discussed. The simple gray theme that I used on Wednesday is built into it, and we used a dungeon theme that actually, I believe, came with the Undermountain adventure that we're running the first night. And there's a lot of other themes, and a lot of players have created free themes that you can just add.
So do you know what it's written in, what the core language is? I know it uses a scripting language, uses Lua for the scripting in XML.
I've parsed a little bit of most of the extensions are essentially XML files and a few graphics all zipped up in a zip file and renamed. I hacked the font extension just this week and changed the font to Helvetica, because Helvetica is owned, and so I had Helvetica on my system already, and so I just added that to Fantasy Grounds, could add it just with some small XML.
Do you know if with the new edition that's coming out, whether they're going to have an open API for it?
I don't know about that. I downloaded it this week, and I have a game this evening on the new version, and pleased with it. It's almost identical. It's got a few additional features, I think dynamic lighting, but as far as the interface, the map, everything else, all of the things that we hate about the classic version, they carried those over into the Unity version. So that's unfortunate. A lot of the players haven't upgraded to the Unity, so most players are still using classic. A lot of players are still using classic, and part of that is they've offered a 40% discount if you've already have the Ultimate license to go to Unity, but that isn't effective for Steam buyers. Steam buyers have to wait for the non-beta release before they can get the discount. And so to save 40% off $150, I'm going to wait a few months until the Steam version comes out, because I bought my license under the Steam format.
Yeah, Googling around, Jimmy, it looks like it's written in C++.
Okay.
Which tracks with both the era that it was developed and what the interface looks like. And I guess what it's doing is it's got an interpreter for the Lua language, and then it's just got an XML reader for a lot of these things.
I don't know. Sometimes I think the interface is kind of machine language, personally, but that's me.
It's assembly on the back end.
It's assembly, yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
The big advantage of the Unity for me is that I'm a Mac user, and if you're a Linux, I've got a player that actually has a Linux on his laptop, and we have to run in Wine, which is not another emulator, I guess is. But to run it, so there's that extra layer that Mac and Linux users have to use, and Unity eliminates that. It's native for those platforms under the Unity platform.
Yeah, so I wanted to tap into Steve Marr a little bit on this, because he also is a Mac user and has been doing the emulation. Now, obviously, Andrew's got experience with it and is used to whatever idiosyncrasies may exist, but what's it been like for you, Steve, to run it in emulation, since so many people are Mac users now compared to when this software was originally written?
It's not bad at all. I've run into the same problems that you all run into. So it looks the same. It's just running in a Wine window. Same problem with spanning across monitors. There's no functional difference. And, downloading and installing is, no problem at all.
One of the other issues with Classic is that it is a 32-bit application. And so it's got some memory limits, and we are moving lots of graphic files and a lot of data is being kept in memory for it, and the Unity is going to be a 64-bit app, or is a 64-bit app. So they're hoping to resolve some of the memory issues with that.
And that is an issue because I have one laptop that's running Catalina, and I can't run the current version of Audacity for our podcast. I can't run other applications that I had no idea didn't have a 64-bit version because I didn't look it up, and I can't run Fantasy, grounds on it. So I've got another laptop. I have another laptop with High Sierra on it, and that's the one I'm using right now that I have access to. I'm glad that I have access to something else in the house.
In fairness to Apple, I mean, this is just another example of them pushing the envelope and saying, well, we're just going to, get rid of this thing that we don't think should be supported. And they've gotten rid of 32-bit applications probably, well, they certainly have this quicker than anyone else, but I happen to think not quick enough. I think Windows should have done it too.
Here.
I suspect they're doing that because they're expecting to shift to ARM architecture soon.
That is the rumor.
Nerds.
Andrew, I have a question. So what do you think would be the limit of the number of players you can handle? I know our group is 5 right now. What have you ran into any kind of issues, or have you even had a larger group than that?
I haven't had a larger group from that, but I'm not sure that, DMing a party of 8 is never fun anyway. So some people may like that. Some people may enjoy that. That's just there's too much dead time between actions, but for players, I think when you get that many, you end up with players drifting off.
It's a challenge for sure. With 5, it can be a challenge. So that was just a question. I'm just kind of curious about, but
my online games typically are 4 or 5 players.
So also, I'll say the interface, somewhat like Roll20, tends to somewhat preference certain styles of play over others. So if you're a heavy theater of the mind person, then this application is, I don't want to say less useful. That's not true. I don't know. It likes the
overkill, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. It likes the tactical map-based way of thinking about it, which I think, I personally think is inevitable in any role-playing situation that's going to come up as something you have to do. And it fits that tool set really well. But if you tend to avoid that a lot, then somewhat other than a really good character sheet system, it may not have as much of a place in your game. I don't know. You have to sort of weigh that out, I think.
Someone said that there are 3 pillars to a good RPG, role-playing, combat and action, and then exploration. And, a lot of the character classes are built around that spatial maneuverability. You've got, there are fighter feats that allow you to reposition yourself relative to others. Being able to run combats in theater of the mind, or choosing to run combats in theater of the mind as opposed to using a board, really diminishes the contribution for some classes. It will gear your party to choose other classes. And I run theater of the mind combats in my game at times. If I'm in a situation where it's a huge battle, then I don't want to have 50 or 100 tokens trying to maneuver those on the board, and we'll just do a massive combat, sort of theater of the mind and run it that way. So, but I do agree that if you don't have a combat focused game or a spatial where spatial awareness is important, then Fantasy Grounds might be a little bit of overkill for you.
All right. So what do you guys think about this versus Roll20? Generally speaking, I'll start off. I have to say that as much as I've knocked the interface, and I 100% disagree with Steve that it's totally valid, totally needs to be knocked. I think it's a better product than Roll20, all things being equal. There's some features that Roll20 has, like the pages, that I think would be really cool if we could get into Fantasy Grounds somehow. Or if there is a way to do it, it's not real intuitive to me how you do that. But I think, all in all, this is a better product, despite the cost in the interface. What do you guys think?
I think I could agree with you on that. As I said, at least from me trying to be in Andrew's shoes when we're playing through a game, and kind of watching how easily he seems to be able to handle everyone's combat, how it does initiative, the combat tracker kind of following through. It seems to be very easy. And the nice thing is like for exploring like a dungeon, it works very well. Now, I mean, some of the stuff that we've played, we're not always in a dungeon or anything else, and so the theater of the mind works perfectly fine. But there's been numerous situations that I recall from when I was playing, and it's like, well, you might describe, it's a 10-foot wide hallway, blah, 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 and then someone's gotten turned around slightly because of, but this you can just see, here's the hallway, you have the map, you can see it, you can physically move your character down, or you show where you want to move, and then Andrew releases that, and then you actually can move down there. He opens the area up so you can see more of what you're actually getting into. And it works exceptionally well, I think, for that. So that's something I don't think you can do in Roll20. So you're kind of limited almost to, well, here's what the map kind of looks like, and you can do some things when I want to go here, and you can do some similar things, not quite as adeptly, but you can do it. So overall, I have to agree. I think Fantasy Grounds, has the upper edge on that, even though you do have to pay for it, which I wouldn't have a problem paying for it, but it definitely is an issue of that learning curve to be a GM for it. And that's the one thing I think would be kind of annoying is that if, I GM, or, 1 weekend and then it's like, oh, we're finishing that up. Frank's going to now GM. It's like, well, he's got to buy it now. If everyone, so we all can't really just, get by on using the free version, I guess.
That model is that if everyone buys the standard version, then you can, everybody can connect to the same game, but everybody would need to purchase it. You couldn't have any free players with just the standard version. So everybody could have the $40 one and connect. You don't have to have an ultimate license to game together. The ultimate license allows people who can't afford it to play.
Well, actually in that case, in my viewpoint, it'd be almost worthwhile if I was going to, 170 or 140 for the ultimate?
150. It's 150. 140 right now. I think they're having a 10% discount.
If we only have, generally like 4 or 5 of us, it wouldn't really be much more just to, buy a gift pack and get everybody standard, and then we kind of get rid of that issue. Anyway, something just thinking about, so.
Oh, I was going to say pretty much what Andrew said, because, the more I was looking at it, and I thought, well, $40 a person, that's an actual video game, multiplayer video game that's on sale. And, we'd all have to buy a copy of that anyway. So it's kind of like that. And then, we could hand off games and all that. And the financial burden doesn't fall on one person.
So let me just clarify for our listeners. I'm pretty sure that's just the application. It doesn't include any of the supplements. So you would have to buy the supplements in addition to that, or use the free stuff
that's
available.
Well, you can populate the supplements. So what you're really paying for is the labor that it would cost to enter all of the stats for the monster manual, or to enter the stats for the magic items out of the DMG, or to have the added stats for whatever character class. But you can manually enter those as well. So if you've already got the books and you wanted to hold off buying the monster manual, you could. And I think they actually sell monster packets based on type of monster. So you can buy all of the beasts, for example, if you have a wilderness campaign, and you could run some, and it's like $3 or $4 to buy that expansion. So you don't have to buy the monster manual all at once. You can buy smaller pieces of it to fit your campaign to sort of build up over time.
Right now, I see that Steam has the 4-pack for Fantasy Grounds for $120.
So, Stephen, you in particular were very critical of Roll20. I think its interface, it frustrates you. I think deservedly so. What's your feeling on Fantasy Ground versus Roll20? Both of which have, I think we can all agree, not modern substandard interfaces if we were designing it today.
Right. They're both terrible in their own sweet way. And, John was a...
It's the pacer versus the
yes,
gremlin.
Yes, yeah. And some guy over there's got a Pinto, and you got a guy with a Maverick,
analogy,
and
yeah.
everybody's jealous of the guy with the Maverick because it's a little bigger, it doesn't explode.
Did you say it doesn't explode?
The Mustang
Yes,
2.
Yes, it doesn't explode. Yeah,
Yeah, like the Pinto.
Yeah,
or the pacer. I think was
Yeah.
the other one that exploded.
But for our listeners who are not familiar with 1970s automobiles, let it be known that they were awful.
Crappy
They
1970s
were awful.
automobiles.
So the cars of our childhood were terrible. Terrible, dangerous, exploding. Yeah. So
Kids
anyway.
these days have it too easy. We had exploding cars in my time.
Wait, airbags?
Well, that's how we got flying cars.
It's true. That's true. Yeah, that's awful. Now I'm thinking about, I was riding in a Mustang 2 with my mom in Bluefield when it came on the radio that Elvis had died. And then a week later, at that same intersection, my mom was T-boned by
Elvis.
T-boned. So she was sideswiped by a cop who didn't have his siren on. And anyway, that has nothing to do with user interfaces, so please delete this from the podcast. That's
the clip.
Damn it to hell.
So back to the question
Yes.
at hand, Steve. What comparing the two, which
you see, they're both awful in their own way, but the functionality difference, between the two and what you can do in Fantasy Grounds, I believe that, accepting the interface that you have to use has a much greater payoff for what you can do as a group in the game. So, I would love for Fantasy Grounds to have a modern interface. I'd love it to have an interface like that one we looked at. That what was that one called?
Like Astra or something like that.
Astral.
It was, anyway,
yeah.
Astral.
Yeah. If
we have, maybe we'll do one about that
Yeah.
later. We haven't played with it. It's missing what we consider to be a critical feature. Oddly enough, we haven't tried in Fantasy Grounds, which is whiteboarding. It just doesn't have that feature. But
right. But yeah, I would give Fantasy Grounds, the edge for all of its capabilities. However, Roll20 definitely has its purpose. And I've got to say that I believe Andrew has to go around 12:15.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about the why I chose Fantasy Grounds over Roll20, and it really had to do with where the content is stored. I didn't want to spend 10, 15 hours building out a content to have it on, because I think Roll20 only has a subscription plan, and your content, I believe, is stored on their servers. And if something happened where I was no longer able to afford my subscription, or their servers went down, they go bankrupt or whatever, all that work that I put in there, I could not use. And with Fantasy Grounds, where I've already purchased the software, it's on my machine, anything I develop is on my machine, Fantasy Grounds can go bankrupt tomorrow, and I can still, as long as I have a copy of the demo version, play around my table or play over the internet with it, and use the content that I've already created. I don't have to worry about that disappearing.
I have one question. One thing I will say too, I noticed the compendiums are about half the price than if you're buying them through Roll20. But can you use any of the compendiums? For instance, Call of Cthulhu. We've talked a lot about it. We've been playing that lately, and I've noticed it's comparable to the PDF version on Chaosium's website. Whereas if I buy the compendium through Roll20, it's full retail price, which is $55. So if you buy a compendium or anything, is it in a PDF format or something you can use outside of Fantasy Grounds, or is it just Fantasy Grounds only?
It's a Fantasy Grounds only. It's an XML file that's stored in a directory, I believe. And so, mean, you could unzip the XML file and look at it if you wanted, but it is it's specifically designed and tailored for use within the Fantasy Grounds interface.
And if it's an XML, I imagine you could save it as a PDF. If you, I'm thinking probably.
I guess if you wrote a parser for it, you could, sure.
So if Andrew is going to have to leave here in just a few minutes, you want to go ahead and do your 12 questions?
We're probably running a little long. I mean, I would like to do that, but if Andrew has to go, it may take a while to get through that. So.
Want to go through 6 questions instead of 12?
Let's do 5 questions.
5 questions. Pick your 5.
So, Andrew, what was the first RPG you ever played? And what kind of character did you play?
I played at Eastern Kentucky University when I was 12, 13 years old. And one of the teaching assistants, or I guess he was the RA, ran a game there, and it was a bunch of the campers and college students playing, and that's where I was introduced to it. I actually had first edition rules before that and had fiddled around with it, but I lived in a neighborhood that didn't have any other kids in it, so my play options were limited.
And what kind of character did you play?
Oh, I played a rogue. Surprising.
Oh, there you go. So, do you prefer to play as a game master or just as a player?
I prefer to play.
Question 3 is, what is your favorite game to play or run?
Well, I'm pretty much just a D&D guy. I don't haven't really exposed myself too much to others. I played Magic the Gathering, but that's not really quite the same, but you know.
What is your favorite gaming moment?
I think it would have to be Steve Mara's Vorpal Sword.
Oh. Sorry,
We definitely need to elaborate this one a little bit.
I think we were playing 2nd edition, weren't we, Steve? And
Yes.
he had a Vorpal Sword, and he had some magic dice, and he beheaded pretty much every encounter that we played. And we played for months, and that Vorpal Sword it was, as a DM, it was the worst and the best thing that I could have ever given him.
Oh man, I had totally forgotten about that.
And there was some moment where you jumped off a cliff and landed on, I can't remember,
Yes.
acrobatic stunt.
It was ridiculous, and I rolled 20s and 20s and 20s, and you'll be glad to know that after that game, that 20-sided die that I love so much fell off my desk, rolled across the floor, and went down the quarter-size hole at the base of the radiator in my room into the floorboards, and I could never get it out. I tried vacuum cleaner hoses.
It had served its purpose.
I tried wire with, like, glue on the end. I tried to pry the fucking floorboard up. So, yeah.
It had... The genie in the die had given you its wishes and
it was
moved on.
Gone.
Question 5 is, what makes gaming special to you, and what makes you keep coming back?
I'm a puzzle solver. I like solving the puzzle. I like unfolding the exploration bit is what's fun for me, and that's why I keep coming back, because I get exposed to just different puzzles and a different tool set as far as the role-playing part goes to solve that. So if you're playing a wizard, there's a different way to approach a problem. If you're playing a rogue, there's a different way to approach the problem. And that's what I enjoy about it, is the problem solving.
Me too, for sure. Well, Andrew, you have completed the RPG almost half dozen.
The pandemic doesn't.
We'll have to have him back to finish it out.
Yeah, there we go. Anytime, for sure.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, well, that's just our little brief overview of Fantasy Grounds, a little bit of it versus Roll20. Andrew, thank you for being on the show and helping us sort of work through this. Obviously, you've got much more experience than we have, and I think the cool thing is that Andrew's agreed to continue the campaign with us, which may be unwise on his point, but he can't take that back now. And so maybe at a later date, we'll have Andrew back on the show and talk a little bit about that campaign. If you have any questions or comments for us, any at the Roll20 headquarters,
Start over, Frank. I'll edit that out.
Thank you. As always, if you have any questions or comments for us at Roleplay Geeks, you can get us at the information that you'll find later in the podcast. Thanks a lot, Andrew. Well, that's all for this week. Thanks for spending some of your time with us. If you like the show, please take a second to rate and view us wherever you listen to the podcast. It really helps us out. Visit our website at roleplaygeeks.com, where you can find all of our social media links on, to Twitter, Instagram, whatever you want to follow us on, however you like to reach us. And you can always email us at roleplaygeeks@roleplaygeeks.com if you have any questions or topics you'd like to suggest that we should cover in the future. Thanks, and we'll see you again next week.